designing experimental studies, we are required to go for various preparations and deciding before going for experimental study. Experimental study is supposed to be the most sophisticated kind of research in social sciences. So the point is that you must be planning very carefully, and that planning is really important, right? So you should plan your strategy for investigation. You should know your variables very carefully and very meticulously, right? And then you should also control the extraneous, the variables which are intervening, right? Which are contaminating your data, right? So as an experimental researcher, you must know that what are intervening variables, what could possibly contaminate your data, right? So plan well, create a strategy, and go for your investigation, right? Then your research design must be very valid, very objective. Valid because you are testing what your procedure is to test, right? So it should be valid and it should be objective. You must not be putting up any of your personal, affiliation or personal thinking. You should keep aside your subjectivity. So it is objective, and then it's accurate, and it is, of course, economically designed, because we are required to think about the expenditure also. Experimental design sets a framework, and that framework is really important, because when you are to formulate an experiment, you should go very carefully, right, in the selection of your samples, in respondents, right, and then the kind of treatment you are supposed to give them, and then how would you check their performance, how would you control the moderating variables, right? So you are required to go and follow a particular framework, right? Educate tests of the relations among variables, because since in study there are so many variables involved, particularly when you are doing your research regarding the the teaching and the learning environment. So how would you control variables which are to be controlled, right? So that is also the part of your planning, right? And what are the active and assigned variables, by the way? What are the variables which are actively taking part, right? Like the independent variables and the dependent variables, and then their connections. And is there any variable which would be intervening, which is involved in between, right? So you would be focusing on that connection of active and assigned variables. And then you should also plan well that what statistics are involved, what statistical packages you would use, what statistical tools and techniques are required to be used in order to evaluate the performance of the dependent variable, the changes and the variations of the dependent variable, right? So you must decide, and then you should also control and you should also create the experiment in a very controlled manner, because the experiment is the treatment which is to be controlled by the researcher, right? So that is the delimiting of the situation, right? So that is also required to be carried out by a researcher, and it should be like a very precision-based activity, right? And that precision-based is basically about your planning, because you are going to plan your experiment. You are the architecture of your experiment. You are the engineer of your experiment. So you must consider that what cares are to be taken, what steps are to be taken in order to come up with a pure experimental study, and so that the changes and the variation in the dependent variables are only and only taking place because of the manipulation of the independent variable, right? The rest of the variables are controlled and they are not taking part in the activity. So that is actually the design which is required to be planned by researchers who want to go for experimental studies, right? So the more you involve your energy and your understanding of the context and the experiment, the more it is going to be a true study, right? It should be a true study because the experiment is to be handled very carefully. And these are the points, the steps which are to be taken before finalizing your study based on experimental research design.